Okay, welcome to Part B, Privateers and Pirates in the Early Modern Era. This is a topic that a lot of people get excited about, of course. Pirates have a big presence in pop culture. People are fascinated with pirates. I grew up in North Carolina, and North Carolina historically, back in the colonial era, was a big haven for pirates, including Blackbeard. And so when I was a kid, in elementary school and in middle school, we learned about the different pirates that were stationed off the North Carolina coast. But pirates were all over in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean, Madagascar. Really big, really big story in the history of money, because pirates or privateers, depending on which one you're talking about, collectively we'll call them buccaneers. Buccaneers were their number one prize was gold and silver coin. Now there were other prizes that a pirate or a privateer would take, luxury goods, spices, high valued items. Pirates were more than happy to plunder these items as well, but gold and silver coin being that universal measure of value, universally accepted everywhere, was their number one prize. So, what is privateering? Privateering, or privateers, were captains who were granted by the government commissions of war to loot foreign ships. Foreign ships, ships belonging to powers that the country was at war with. So in this case, in the 16th century, the Dutch, the French, and the English made habit of granting these privateering commissions to private men of war, to private merchants, to private captains, licensing them, giving them permission to loot Spanish silver fleets crossing the Caribbean. Now, we saw this diagram in lecture, or part A of lecture 11. All of these Spanish galleons trekking the Caribbean, going across the Atlantic Ocean, and then heading way to Spain. For much of the 16th century, these galleons were unprotected. Now, eventually, the Spanish figured out that this was a really big problem and would have convoys that would accompany some of these ships in order to fight off buccaneers. But this is a great temptation for the buccaneers. And in the early days, in the 16th and into the 17th centuries, governments who were rivals of Spain, who were rightly so wary of Spanish might and the power of the Spanish Empire, gave these private men of war permission. Go ahead and loot them. And it was a very common practice. And England at the time, Holland, and France simply did not have a large enough navy. They did not have a professional navy to counter the Spanish on the high seas. So, hey, allow private men of war to do it, and then allow them to keep a large portion of the spoils. Keep a large portion of the spoils, which is obviously a huge incentive for privateers. Privateers were not always, these attacks did not always take place on the high seas. Sometimes privateers attacked coastal ports, raided coastal ports, and so across what was called the Spanish Main, the coastal areas, especially here in Central America. Not uncommon for buccaneers to raid those ports. Two of the most famous privateers in history, Sir Francis Drake and Sir Henry Morgan. Sir Francis Drake was commissioned by Queen Elizabeth to loot Spanish silver ships on his voyage across the globe. In the 1570s, Drake circumnavigated the globe for England. He wasn't the first man to circumnavigate the globe. Ferdinand Magellan's crew did that in the 1520s. But Drake circumnavigates the globe and along his voyage plunders Spanish and Portuguese ships. Ends up, by the end of it, plundering 600,000 pounds sterling of silver coin from this one voyage, and returned back to London to a hero's welcome. And at that point actually was knighted by the Queen. So he was Francis Drake and then became Sir Francis Drake after that great and epic privateering voyage. By the way, Queen Elizabeth, when she faced off when England faced off against the Spanish Armada in 1588, most of the ships fighting for the side of England in that epic battle in 1588 against the Armada, most of those ships were privateers, because again the English just did not have a strong navy at that time, and so you hire these private men. Sir Henry Morgan was another very famous privateer, of course the namesake of the rum, Captain Morgan. Sir Henry Morgan operated out of Jamaica and was known for his exploits against the Spanish in the Caribbean Sea, but also on some land raids as well. His most famous attack against the Spanish was in 1670, so about 100 years after Drake. The English are still doing this. And in 1670, and Morgan was a man who had a commission from the English government. Morgan led a fleet of 10 ships and 500 men to Portobello, Panama. On the map, you'll see where that is, right there. And there was a giant fortress, a Spanish fortress at Portobello. And when they arrived, or at a distance, and they could see the fortress ahead, many of his men were quite worried. I'm not sure, Captain, that we can do this. Yeah, we have a giant force, 500 men, but this is going to be tough. This is a major fortress. And Morgan gave this rousing speech, promising all the buccaneers, look, all right, we can do this. The Spanish have no idea we're coming. We'll wait for the sun to set, and then we're going to attack in the early evening. And they'll have no idea. We'll plunder the city, and you're going to have more gold and silver than you can imagine. Sure enough, the sun went down. They arrived in the port, and Morgan and the buccaneers attacked. The soldiers who were manning the fort caught them completely by surprise. Some of them were actually asleep in their beds at the time. The Spanish counterattacked, but it failed, and Morgan and his men win that battle, and they remained in Portobello for 2 months. And during that 2-month period, just plundered the city and the fortress, ended up collecting 200,000 silver coins. 200,000 silver coins. The governor of Panama, during that occupation, wrote Morgan a message and asked him, how did you take down this fortress with comparatively few men? And Morgan replied simply by sending a pistol to the Panama governor. Anyway, after that was done, Morgan's men went to Jamaica, which was an English colony at the time, and received a hero's welcome when they returned back to Jamaica. Really interesting. But so pirates, there's a lot of legend about them, of course, and the Pirates of the Caribbean. But it's been long before that. Treasure Island, and people have long been fascinated with them. And you have to be careful to be able to distinguish between myth and reality. But there's actually some truth behind some of the caricatures and the myth. Actually, the pirate ship was a far more was surprisingly democratic compared to what a sailor might experience on other ships, or especially working for a professional state navy. A pirate crew, often had a significant voice in what they were going to do next and had some influence over the captain. And the potential rewards of a successful raid, there could be a windfall gain for a buccaneer, and they could do quite well. And then they would, the buccaneer would, after the successful raid, would go to a friendly port, and they would spend their money lavishly. And actually, in colonial America, what became the 13 colonies, what became the U.S., there were several sites along colonial America. New York was one of them. The Carolinas was another. Philadelphia was another, where pirates were mostly tolerated. It's like, hey, come on in. And pirates would bring in their booty, all that coin, and they would spend their money very liberally and lavishly in taverns and brothels and all the rest. Really, really fascinating bit of history. When we begin surveying the history of the American dollar and the American currency, actually, I'll go back to this just briefly again and remind you that, hey, actually, pirate money was quite common in the colonies, and especially in the early colonial period. Lots of pirate money in circulation. This is a picture of later depiction of William Kidd, very famous privateer / pirate, who upon landing at New York City, and he's receiving quite the welcome at New York City. So, very appealing, but there was also tremendous risk, because while you could have windfall gains if you were a buccaneer, and this attracted a lot of men, a lot of sailors who were just fed up with working for the Royal Navy or being ill-treated by a merchant captain who participated in more legal trade. A pirate life was very appealing. There was a certain allure about it that you just couldn't deny. There was a risk too, and if you crossed over from privateering, which was legal, and crossed over into piracy, then death penalty, and many pirates were convicted and received quite a gruesome end. This was William Kidd. Here's a portrait of William Kidd. He was a privateer, and then he turned pirate. So, and oftentimes this was one of the problems with privateering as policy, as state policy. Once you license somebody as a privateer, it was really difficult to regulate them, and so they could go rogue. And so a pirate was essentially a privateer gone rogue. Now no longer has permission from the state to engage in this activity, and really just operating as independent entities on the high seas. And this was William Kidd's end right here, and he was positioned here right at the harbor, so that after his trial, so that sailors who are tempted by piracy would see this, and it's very whoa. And think of how graphic that is. The birds, I don't even want to describe it, right? Wow. Okay, maybe I won't become a pirate. Was the point of that public public display of that execution. Anyway, really, really fascinating, and lots of lots of books written on this subject. But yeah, you have to mention it in a history of money because they play a really big role. By the late after the 1690s, England and the major European powers abandoned privateering as state policy. You'll still have pirates like Blackbeard in the 1720s, but Blackbeard wasn't a privateer. Blackbeard was just flat out pirate. We'll take a look at Blackbeard in a few lectures when we look at colonial America. But Blackbeard was just pure pirate. Had no permission from the government. So, but up through the end of the 17th century, privateering was used quite effectively by many of these states. Okay, I think that covers that subject pretty well. See you for part C of lecture 11.